Hello, everyone, and welcome to the pilot episode of the iDebate server, and what we hope will be the start of an ever-expanding marketplace of ideas. I'm the moderator for tonight's debate, Ludendorff, and the topic will be, is there sufficient historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ? Arguing in the affirmative with the blue name is the iPhone user Pious, a Catholic apologist and theologian, while arguing in the negative with the red name is the iPhone user OhMyBad man, an atheist activist and conservative political commentator. Each debater will be given a 5-minute opening argument. After each debater has given their opening, there will be a fuck. They will then have 10 minutes to rebut their opponent. After the rebuttals, they will have 20 minutes of open dialogue, asking each other questions with as minimal interruptions as possible. After the dialogue, they will both offer a 5-minute closing. This will conclude the debate, at which point we will allow the audience members to connect and ask questions to the debaters. The debaters will only answer questions that are directly asked, so if you wish to hear both people answer, make sure you ask both of them. Q&A will last 30 minutes. After this 30 minutes has expired, the recording will stop, so any further discussion between the debaters or the audience will not be included in the YouTube upload. The rules are quite simple. The debaters will not be allowed to go over time during the opening, or they will be muted. The rebuttal, however, will be given 15 to 20 seconds of overlap, since the debaters will likely be creating it as we go along. The opening dialogue will be as free as possible, and while the debaters are restricted from directly insulting one another at any point during the exchange, profanity will not be censored as long as it is not used gratuitously. As the conversation between the debaters becomes incoherent, I, the moderator, will intervene to bring it back to the point at hand. The closing will also last for no longer than 5 minutes, or the debater will be muted. During each phase of the debate, I will let the debaters know when they have 1 minute left, 30 seconds left, 10 seconds left, and if they're still talking after their time expires, they'll be muted, and we will move on to the next phase. The audience is allowed to utilize the text chat, fact-check the debaters, and deliberate the topic among themselves. However, you will not be allowed to connect into the Q&A, at which I'll select audience members based on a first-come, first-served basis. You will be assigned the role of questioner and will be allowed to connect to the voice chat. If both debaters understand and agree to the rules, we will go ahead and begin. Pious, as the guest to our server this evening, you will be giving your opening statement first. You may start whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much. Hello, my name is Andras, known here as Pious. I first would like to thank my opponent and moderators for making this debate possible. I wish them the best in pursuit of truth. I also thank God for granting me the opportunity to be his instrument, as well as granting me the help from my peers, too many to name. In any case, I'm here today to affirm that there is enough historical evidence to conclude that Jesus of Nazareth, also known as Christ, resurrected from the dead. However, by the end of this talk, and should skeptics persist in their skepticism of my claim, I would invite them to at least consider any other possibility that follows from this evidence we have is just as miraculous or supernatural, holding the place as the most well-attested supernatural event in history that no other event follows. I would first like to establish that I follow a consistent historical criteria that's on the axiom that claims which hold a strong amount of evidence can be reasonably believed to be true until further evidence rises. This basic epistemology is followed in science, history, criminology, and other studies. If my opponent isn't satisfied with the evidence to support this nearly 2,000-year-old claim, then I would ask them to establish and define what historical evidence would be sufficient for belief in any historical event. Now, it is nearly historical consensus, even by non-Christian scholars, that Jesus at least existed, died by crucifixion, and was buried. Other growing number of scholars of the same kind also agree that the apostles and others believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Whether or not this happened is the point of this debate. This conclusion by many professional historians and scholars is based on a few facts that I hope my opponent can agree on. First, that there is plenty of documentation, such as the four Gospels, which are all attributed to followers of Christ or contemporaries of the followers, that draw from eyewitness testimony. It is important to note that no evidence exists telling us that these Gospels were originally anonymous. Acts of the Apostles written by Luke, and letters, namely 1 Corinthians by Paul, are also part of the presenting documentation. I would also like to note that I'm not claiming divine inspiration of the Bible wholesale. I'm just positing that these are historical documents that carry information we can use. There is external evidence that corroborates some of these claims of the documents from archaeological sources or non-Christian historians, and even some of the sources being enemies of Christianity. So I would also like to posit that people in the early centuries that would advocate for Christianity were persecuted in every material way, and no worldly incentive to be Christians or Christian leaders is evident. The apostles and other eyewitnesses that recorded the events they themselves experienced were willing to be persecuted for their claims, and some were most definitely martyred for their claims regarding Christianity and Jesus' resurrection. There's not a single redaction out of any of the eyewitnesses, despite threats, torture, and execution by those that wish to see Christianity falsified in order to protect their own political, religious, or social power. The events in the documents containing historically preserved eyewitness testimony are not lies. Thus, the documents in question are mostly historically reliable insofar as they give an accurate gist or an essential representation of the experiences the eyewitnesses had, and they're true. The Gospels and other documentation gives witness to the ministry and teaching of Jesus during his life, who claims to be the Messiah. The arrest, torture, trial, and execution of Jesus under Pontius Pilate is also recorded. The demise of Jesus by the hand of the Roman power is an unexpected downfall of the Messiah, despite Jesus making vague predictions about it. The torture and execution by crucifixion, granted that Jesus died on a cross, is guaranteed. Jesus was buried in a tomb owned by Joseph of Arimathea for about 3 days. So all of these are thus historically recorded facts. The Gospels and other documentations within the New Testament record that the tomb of Jesus was found empty, with the discovery first made by women. The tomb was affirmed to be empty and with wrappings left behind, and no denial that Jesus' tomb still had the body. The apostles gave witness to Jesus appearing to various events and appearing to multiple people at a time a few days after the death. Are known as reliable
1 minute.
witnesses. Apostles then convert many in Jerusalem and spread out elsewhere to other countries and nations. And any explanation that would follow from this evidence is just as, if not more miraculous, claim Jesus made or his apostles made. Almost, if not all, evidence points towards the vindication of Jesus' claim
30
that
seconds.
he is the Messiah, and that the claim Jesus rose from the dead. Therefore, Jesus died, was buried, and was resurrected from the dead.
So I take it it's my turn now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, I would like to begin by disclaiming my position. I am not arguing that Jesus Christ did not resurrect. I am arguing that there is not sufficient historical evidence to believe that this happened. For most of human history and still today, the majority of people who study the New Testament are believing Christians. Thus, I would argue that the religious dominion of this particular field of study has spurred unreliable and inconsistent methods of assessment that seem to only be used when discussing Jesus Christ. Myths of resurrection are abundant throughout history, as it's one of the most employed characteristics of a god or a deity. That is, the ability to conquer death. Many historical figures that we are reasonably certain existed, and even some that we know existed, have similar resurrection and immortality tales, from Apollonius of Tyana to Elvis Presley. Of course, in all cases except for Jesus Christ, we dismiss the magical and miraculous because we cannot reasonably defend the proposition that any of these people have resurrected or are somehow immortal. So why is Jesus the exception? I would argue it's because people presuppose his divinity. As of today, not a single resurrection has ever been recorded or verified. We have absolutely no precedents to suggest that coming back from the dead is even possible, let alone probable, especially after 3 days. Add on to that the suggestion that Jesus Christ never died again, and you have not one but two different violations of the laws of biology and physics. These are what we call miracles, an event so infinitesimally improbable that it must logically be the least likely explanation for anything. I could invent several explanations for the disappearance of Christ's body that are all far more probable than resurrection. Anyone could. The resurrection is strictly a matter of theology, not history, especially when you consider that the majority of history is determined by what most probably happened. The evidence that we are expected to accept comes from a series of accounts written over a generation after the resurrection was supposed to have happened, according to modern scholarship. These accounts, traditionally referred to as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, along with the epistles of Paul, are not eyewitness accounts. contrary to the attestations of believers. The Gospels are all anonymous and written in the third person literary perspective, given their names by church leaders over a century after they were written and then enforced as dogma. On top of our inability to determine who the authors were, we are also met with a great number of discrepancies between the accounts, which further diminishes their reliability. To be facetious, we have more consistent eyewitness testimony in greater volume for alien abductions and Bigfoot. The first gospel, Mark, doesn't even describe a resurrection of Jesus per se. The earliest copies end at chapter 16, verse 8, with Mary Magdalene, Mary mother of James, and Salome fleeing from the empty tomb after having met a strange man who told them Jesus was risen, and they didn't tell anybody according to this passage. Many decades later, newer copies appear with the last 12 verses, which describe Jesus reuniting with the disciples, and even includes a conversation he had with them, which shows to us that his words have in fact been added to. The earliest reference to the resurrection is 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 3 through 8, written by Paul of Tarsus, who admits he did not personally bear witness to this event. Instead, he learned of it through revelation some decades later, as we read in Galatians chapter 1, verse 12. So the first account of the resurrection was written 25 years after it was supposedly occurred by someone who didn't see it personally and were expected to take this as evidence. In no other circumstance would that be considered reasonable. The Gospels exacerbate this issue, having been written 20 to 40 years after the epistles of Paul, 20 to 40. I had mentioned the discovery of the tomb above from the Gospel of Mark, and funny enough, that narrative is contradicted by Matthew, Luke, and John on almost every aspect. The explanations that the apologists attempt to provide for these hopeless contradictions are lazy at best and sometimes dishonest at worst. I expect I'll have to expand upon these problems with the Gospels in my rebuttal, as my opponent will undoubtedly be employing them since, frankly, they're all he's got. And as I said at the start, these arguments are presented from a presuppositional lens, which is in fact prescribed by Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 13 through 15, where it reads, "And we speak of these things in words not taught by human wisdom, but by the Spirit, interpreting spiritual things to those who are spiritual. Those who are unspiritual do not receive the gifts of God's Spirit, for they are foolish to them, and they are unable to discern them, because they are not spiritually understanding. Those who are spiritual discern all things, and they are themselves subject to no one else's scrutiny." This method is inherently flawed and arguably dishonest. Working backwards from a pre-assumed conclusion is the exact opposite of reasonable analysis. It's the intellectual equivalent of pouring the milk before you pour the cereal. Additionally, this passage enforces the idea that because we non-believers don't view things according to their conclusion, that they are immune to our criticism. Effectively, in order to accept the historical evidence presented for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, you have to already believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and that's my time.
All right, we'll be moving on to the rebuttal. Pious, you have 10.
Okay, well, to begin, I would like to reaffirm that the Gospels, there's absolutely no evidence that they were anonymous. To begin, any and all early documents that have been found about the Gospels all have titles, and there is enough internal and external evidence within these Gospels of attribution. The only anonymous document part of the New Testament that is claimed to be anonymous is Hebrews, and understandably so, it is very controversial as to within the external evidence, the manuscripts found, and other early Christian writers. They do not have a consensus as to who wrote that document. But concerning the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there's unanimous consensus as to the names and attributions to these Gospels. Now, to claim that there are not eyewitnesses is baseless. Considering that we have two apostles, Matthew, being a tax collector, he would have known to write, and definitely not illiterate, was one of the writers of the Gospels and the accounts of Jesus's life. Secondly, we have John, one of the inner three of the apostles, who wrote the Gospel of John around the end of his life. Now we have Mark as well, who is not very known, but is to be a companion of Peter, not among the 12, but very much has an easy access to the witnesses of Jesus's life. We have as well Luke, a Gentile companion of Paul. He is presumably Greek, but definitely a Gentile, which is not far-fetched to say that he has known Greek or knows how to write. Now, understanding that John is considered to be, alongside Peter, to be considered illiterate, we need to understand what this word means. So in Acts 4:5-6, we have that it says that rulers and elders and scribes were gathered together, had John and Peter right in front of them, and they perceived that they were uneducated common men. The word for uneducated and illiterate in Greek is agrammatoi, which means in general lack of formal education and not general literacy. Epictetus in his work discourses, I believe. Excuse me. Give me 1 second. In discourses, yes. He says that if a man accustoms himself to write ungrammatically, is the English translation, but in the Greek, they uses the word agrammatoi. Writing ungrammatically is the proper translation for this word of agrammatoi, not necessarily writing illiterately, which would make no sense. So another thing that my opponent proposes is that there's a presumption that miracles are improbable or unlikely, and that historians need to conclude their conclusions based on what is most likely. However, this is a very unwarranted assumption to have. It is not part of the definition of miracle that it is unlikely. There are many different miraculous claims made throughout the history of time, and the very point of this debate is to affirm whether or not this specific claim is a miracle or not. So it is rather circular to state that there's not enough sufficient historical evidence for this miraculous claim merely because a miraculous claim has been made, and therefore it is unlikely. We don't know probabilities of miracles unless we had an extensive study of which miracles were confirmed or not. And this would be one of those miracles. So we cannot conclude whether or not this would be probable or possible. Simply put, what we're doing right now is finding out whether or not Jesus died and then was seen afterwards without any kind of other naturalistic implications, such as hallucinations, such as drug use, and any of the such. The evidence that we have presented in this gospel is sufficient enough to show that we don't have is sufficient enough to show that any other naturalistic explanation is just the supernatural, and rather that the claim made by the apostles were vindicated, especially the one made by Jesus himself, stating that he is the Son of God. My opponent also states that Paul did not personally witness to the resurrection, even though in 1 Corinthians he specifically states that Jesus has appeared to him. Now, while it is true that he has not been there for the events, we have to understand the background of Paul being a former persecutor of Christians. Knowing that, we would know that there is absolutely no reason for Paul to have any sort of experience or hallucination, should one call it that. And we should also know that should he have converted and visited the apostles themselves, then he would have received oral tradition from them, which claims that Jesus lived, died, and rose, as it is stated in 1 Corinthians. In fact, historical studies, scholarly studies have examined this particular claim inside Corinthians and showed that the creed there is not Paul's own writing, but rather an actual oral tradition that he has gotten. And it's very possible that it has been passed down and used as a learning tool for other disciples of the apostles to be passed down. Thus, the dating can go back way before the 50s. Now, my opponent also has stated that there's plenty of discrepancies between the Gospels. However, I would like to propose the idea that it is not within the nature of ancient Greco-Roman biographies to meticulously account for every little small detail or word for word point in every speech. In fact, it is actually more likely for a Greco-Roman biography to not specifically have the date, the details within their writings, because of the fact that many of them would be going off of memory. However, I think as moderns, we consider memory to be rather very inferior because of the fact that we're so dependent upon the internet and modern day schooling. We have to understand that there are many similarities between the Greco-Roman biographies of the actual time that historians use, such as Life of Josephus, Parallel Lives, Lives of the Caesars, and Life of Demoniacs, and the Gospels, especially when it comes to memory. For example, in Life of Alexander by Plutarch, it says, "In case I do not tell all the famous actions of these men, nor even speak exhaustively at all in each particular case, but in epitome for the most part, not to complain, for it is not histories that I'm writing, but lives. And in the most illustrious deeds, there is not always a manifestation of virtue or vice, nay, a slight thing where a phrase or a jest often makes a greater revelation of character than battles when thousands fall." It also continues and goes to say that from Lucian's Life of Demoniacs, "I have made but a small selection
1
of
minute.
material available, but it may serve to give readers some idea of this great man's character." Knowing all of this, we should understand that these discrepancies can be easily explained by misattribution to memory. However, the substance of the Gospels is consistent, that there are certain claims that in essence is held. While the details may vary, the essence of the claims
30
are
seconds.
are adhered to. I would like to further explore that in the dialogue.
Good to go?
Go ahead.
All right, the consensus among historians is that none of the Gospels are eyewitness accounts, and that Mark, being the first, was written no earlier than the year 67 Common Era, with Matthew, Luke, and John following 15 to 20 years after. The Gospels were written anonymously, again in the third person literary perspective, and the names were given to them established a century later by church fathers. There's no supporting evidence that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts, and at least two of them aren't even purported to be, nor that they were written earlier than the late 60s Common Era. Mark Pearson, the adjunct professor of theology and philosophy, Concordia University, who is a believing Christian, says this: "The argument that the texts of our Gospels are close to the eyewitness reports of the words and deeds of Jesus runs counter to almost all recent scholarship. As we have indicated from time to time, the prevalent view is that a long period of oral transmission in the churches intervened between whatever the eyewitnesses said and the Jesus traditions as they reached the evangelists." So we go down, and now this is a excerpt from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. The question of authorship and sources and the time of this composition of this gospel, specifically Matthew, which my opponent had mentioned, have received many answers, but none of which can claim more than a greater or lesser degree of probability. The one now favored by the majority of scholars is the following: the ancient tradition that the author was the disciple and apostle of Jesus named Matthew is untenable because the gospel is based in large part on the gospel according to Mark. Almost all the verses of that gospel have been utilized in Matthew, and it is hardly likely that a companion of Jesus would have followed so extensively an account that came from one who admittedly never had such an association, rather than rely on his own memories. The attribution of the gospel to the disciple Matthew may have been due to his having been responsible for some of the traditions found in it, but that is far from certain. Furthermore, again, Matthew is also written in the third person literary perspective, and he even refers to the apostle Matthew in the third person in the calling of Matthew, Matthew chapter 9. My opponent also appeals to the apostles themselves, who we really have no record of existing outside of the Gospels and centuries later books by church fathers, though absolutely nothing contemporary. He claims that their martyrdom reinforces the validity of their beliefs, as it's incredibly unlikely that they would die for what they knew was a lie. I would say that it's far more unlikely for someone to come back from the dead after 3 days than it is for someone to lie and die for it. More to the point, my opponent has no evidence that any of the apostles were actually martyred, yet this seems to be the crux of his argument. The Bible itself only describes the death of James, brother of John, son of Zebedee, in Acts 12:1-2, also Stephen, who was not an eyewitness, where it states, about that time King Herod laid violent hands upon some who belonged to the church. He had James, the brother of John, killed with the sword. Nowhere in this passage does it say he was killed for refusing to recant, that he was given the option to recant, or even that he was killed for being a Christian. The rest of the apostles are only claimed to have been martyred by written accounts not decades, but centuries after their deaths. Let's take a look, shall we? John is said to have died of old age, so that's not a martyr. The 2nd century book, the Acts of Peter, written over 100 years after the latest estimates of 1 Peter, says Peter was crucified. Acts of Andrew, also written in the 2nd century and labeled heretical by the Catholic Church, says that he too was crucified, but on an X-shaped cross, which gives us that famous St. Andrew's cross. Again, no indication of being told to recant. Acts of Philip, written 300 years after Philip would have died, says he was crucified, but that the 40 years of torture was a punishment from Christ, so this can't be considered martyrdom. According to the Acts of Thomas, written 200 years after Thomas would have died, it says he was speared in India, which again I doubt can be considered martyrdom, as there's no indication he was told to recant. Perhaps this was just a riot, or he got stabbed by accident, who knows. This book also states that Thomas was Christ's twin brother, so you would have to cherry pick the martyrdom account. Matthias' crucifixion isn't written about until the 14th century in the Protestant work Fox's Books of Martyrs by John Fox, and it's later contradicted in another Protestant book in the 17th century. There are at least 3 competing accounts of Bartholomew's death, and none of them are supported by additional documents. Again, the accounts of his death were written 200 to 300 years after he would have died. Catholic.org says Matthew died naturally, although other accounts say he angered an Ethiopian king for not allowing him to have sex with his niece, and he was killed. That doesn't sound like martyrdom to me. Acts of Thaddeus says that Jude Thaddeus died of old age. Simon the Zealot's death is uncertain, as there are 3 competing accounts, one of which he died of old age. The other 2, he was clubbed to death and crucified. Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews, Book 20, Chapter 9, refers to the death of James, the brother of Jesus, as stoning under the directive of Ananus the Sadducee. Nothing about Josephus' account suggests martyrdom either, as the reason given is just they broke the law. It can also be noted that this chapter describes an uproar of Jews against Ananus for this act, which wouldn't make sense if he was executing a heretical blasphemer. This passage is hypothesized to being tampered with by the church. There's no compelling evidence that the apostles were martyred, as each of these stories comes hundreds of years after the deaths of these people, with no in-between sources. So either these stories were written down from centuries of hearsay and telephone, or they were invented by church fathers seeking to establish credibility to their beliefs. Eusebius is referred to as the founder of church history, yet is ascribed with having been in favor of deceiving people to promote Christianity. In Eusebius' Historia Ecclesiastica, Book 8, Chapter 2, he writes, "We have decided to relate nothing concerning these churches except the things in which we can vindicate the divine judgment. We shall introduce into this history in general only those events which may be useful first to ourselves and afterwards to the posterity of Christianity. Let us therefore proceed to describe briefly the sacred conflicts of the witnesses of the divine word." This is a rather concerning admission of Protestant history. It can be argued that Eusebius is simply omitting history he finds irrelevant, but based on his wording, there's certainly a case here that he is advocating suppressing history that doesn't align with the Christian doctrine. Eusebius was also the person responsible for quote-unquote discovering the Testimonium Flavianum, which is almost unanimously agreed to be a forgery manufactured by 3rd century Christian church fathers. Eusebius also claims that Philo of Alexandria met Simon Peter in Rome, while Philo's writings never detail such an event. Given these facts, it can be reasonably argued that the church fathers were motivated to lie and spin history in favor of their doctrines, so we cannot fully trust the accounts of martyrdom, especially when they were written many generations after the described events would have occurred by people who could not possibly have witnessed them. But if through my falsehood God's truthfulness abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? Romans 3, chapter 3, verse 7. Lastly, I want to discuss the empty tomb narrative. My response to this is simple. How do you know there was an empty tomb? This is yet another "for the Bible tells me so" assertion by my opponent. Victims of crucifixion were rarely ever buried in tombs, but I suppose if the priests truly were afraid that Christ's followers would steal his body, they may go so far as to seal him in a tomb. However, the claim of an empty tomb is only described in the Gospels. It is not mentioned in Paul's epistles. I would like to describe in detail the contradictions we see regarding this discovery. According to Mark chapter 16, Mary Magdalene, Mary mother of James, and Salome went to anoint Jesus' body. Upon arriving to the tomb, they found it was already open, and inside, sitting on the right, was a single man dressed in white who told them Jesus had risen and they should go tell Peter and the apostles. But they run away and they don't tell anybody. Later copies of the Gospels added in verses 9 through 20, which describe Jesus reuniting with the Gospels, or with the apostles, and even telling them that he would return before some of them were dead, which obviously didn't happen. The addendum by scribes is further evidence of the unreliability of the Gospels. Matthew 28 says that only the two Marys went to the tomb, and upon their arrival, an earthquake struck as an angel descended from heaven and rolled away the stone. His visage incapacitated the soldiers, and then he told the Marys to go out and spread the news that Jesus had risen. On their way back, they actually encountered Jesus, who tells them to send the disciples to Galilee. Luke 24 says that Mary Magdalene, Mary mother of James, and Joanna, as opposed to Salome, found the empty tomb, and that they entered it to find it was empty. Then not one but two men in dazzling clothes told them that Jesus had risen and to run and tell the apostles. Peter returns to the tomb alone and finds nothing but linens. John 20 says that Mary Magdalene by herself went to the tomb and found it empty. She saw no one and then ran back to tell Peter and another unspecified disciple. People say that was John. Both Peter and his unnamed disciple run to the tomb, and they too find it empty. They don't understand why, though, and they leave. Mary stays there and weeps. When two angels appear to her and ask her why she was crying, she tells them it's because they've taken Jesus, and then Jesus appears to her there at the tomb, though she doesn't immediately recognize him. These contradictions get worse as the story goes on. We're told different things about where the apostles met Jesus, how many he appeared to at once, how many days he walked around before teaching before ascending to heaven. None of the accounts regarding the resurrection of Jesus match up. It's almost as if they were invented by a different author decades after the event supposedly happened. My opponent may argue that these contradictions strengthen the narrative, because if they all matched, we would believe they copied from one another. Yet when it is pointed out that Matthew and Luke did in fact directly copy from Mark almost word for word, this fact is dismissed as though it has no bearing on their authenticity. To conclude my rebuttal, I would point out that most Christians, if not all, do not predicate their belief in the resurrection based on historical evidence, as their position is one of religious faith and emotional conviction that would not waver regardless of evidence. It could very well be the case that Jesus did rise from the dead, but there truly is nothing to support this, as extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And that's my time.
All right, we will now be moving on to the 20-minute open dialogue. You guys start whenever you...
All right. So that's a lot to unpack. So I think where I would like to start would be regarding, obviously, the authenticity of the Gospels.
Okay.
So my first question would be, I guess my first question for you has to be, your main issue with the Gospel stories is that it's written decades after. Is that correct?
Not that it's written decades after, but it's written decades after by people who couldn't possibly have witnessed the events, and that none of the Gospels agree with each other on major details.
Okay, so let's start with people that couldn't possibly witness the events. Right.
Okay.
So we have the Gospel of John and then the Gospel of Matthew claiming to be apostles. And
Neither of those Gospels claim to be apostles. Nowhere in either of them did they sign their name. And as I said previously, Matthew explicitly refers to himself in the third person in the calling of Matthew, which wouldn't make sense for an eyewitness.
Okay, and how do you know that third person this description is not just the way that they would write it back then? Especially if they're writing the biography of another person.
Because if they were witnessing, wouldn't they say, I saw this, I saw that, this is what he said to me? Like when Jesus is talking to Matthew, right, why wouldn't Matthew say, and he came to me and told me this parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee, and he described in detail what I had done in the temple? But he doesn't do that, and nowhere does he sign his name to the gospel, so you have absolutely no reason to believe that Matthew is the person that's responsible for this gospel. And again, the United Conference of Catholic Bishops agrees with the scholarly consensus that it was not Matthew who wrote that gospel, and that was just attributed to him later by the church.
Okay, so first of all, I'm going to go ahead and tell you that the United States Conference of Bishops is not something, they're not scholars. They're not scholars, and if some
That's
of them
convenient.
are, um, then I would have to disagree, and it's completely okay to disagree. All things considered, we have insurmountable evidence that nearly all of the early documents have titles attributing to each of the Gospels.
Only in
So
the 2nd century and 3rd century.
yeah, but we don't have. Doesn't matter. We don't have anything that's earlier. Considering that we don't have anything surviving that's earlier, that even contradicts my claim that early manuscripts of the Gospels did not have titles, it is extremely telling. And considering it's the 2nd century, that's well within the time period. It's not within, some kind of forgery.
Well, I
And
mean, we
so
know of a forgery in Mark, the last 12 verses of the Gospel of Mark. There's 2 different endings to Mark, which you can read in the NRSV version of the Bible. But if you want a scholar, I would refer you to Roman Catholic scholar Raymond Brown. No gospel identifies its author. The common designations placed before the Gospels, that is, according to the Gospel of Matthew, stem from the late 2nd century and represent an educated estimate of the authorship by church scholars. Jesus did not write an account of his passion, nor did anyone who had been present write an eyewitness account. The scholars agree with me on this issue, that they were not eyewitnesses, that they were written anonymously, and that they didn't get their names until well after any of them were written. How could the church have known who wrote these gospels if none of them signed their name to it?
okay, but the thing is, all right. So I have here a study by Simon J. Gathercole stating that there's titles on nearly almost all of the early New Testament manuscripts, considering that it is very, very possible that the New Testament manuscripts, even earlier before that, or even the original ones, could have had titles as well, is very much a huge consideration. So you can't simply dismiss that possibility based on the fact that they didn't put themselves in the first person. Secondly, we would have John, considering that while he inside the story he didn't refer to himself as John, he did refer to himself as the beloved apostle. Um,
He didn't refer to himself as that either. He said this was the beloved apostle in the end of John, but he doesn't say that's who he was.
he
Again,
said that's who was writing the document, and throughout the
that's not
entire.
what he says. I can actually read off the verse. I mean, you want to link it down there. I think it's John 20:24, John 20:23, something like that. Nope. It would have been a little bit later than that. Hold on. Let me go to Bible.com and just go to the end of John. Maybe it's John 24. I'm not sure.
John 21:24.
John 21:24. Okay. Now I use the NRSV because that's what I've been told is the most accurate by scholars. So John 21, go to the NRSV version.
He says, "This is the disciple who is bearing witness to those things and who has written these things." And he was referring to the beloved, who is the beloved disciple, which throughout the Gospel of John is partaking to the point that he's even extremely near Jesus Christ, especially in the Last Supper.
Right, but it's talking about Peter. When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, "Lord, what about him?" Jesus said to him, "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me." So the rumor spread to the community that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them, and we know the testimony is true. Again, in my sources and references, I have Robert Kaisar, who is a believing New Testament scholar, and he writes the following on the authorship of the Gospel of John. The supposition that the author was one and the same with the beloved disciple is often advanced as a means of ensuring that the evangelist did witness Jesus' ministry. 2 other passages are advanced as evidence of the same, chapter 19, verse 35, and chapter 21, verse 24. but both falter under close scrutiny. 1935 does not claim that the author was one who witnessed the scene, but only that the scene is related to the sound basis of a witness. 2124 is part of the appendix of the gospel and should not be assumed to have come from the same hand as those responsible for the body of the gospel. Neither of these passages therefore persuades many Johannine scholars that the author claims eyewitness status. And I can link that to you as well. Again, this is a believing Christian scholar. There's the link. And that's in the Anchor Bible Dictionary, version 3, pages 919 through 920. All right, now I'd like to ask you a couple questions, if that's okay.
Sure. But later I'm going to come back to that claim.
That's fine, absolutely, no doubt. Okay, I've got to go back to my feed here. I had some prepped questions. My first question to you would be, if I can scroll down to it. Would you still believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ even if all the evidence you presented were proven to be unreliable? That is, your belief is a matter of faith more than evidence.
That is a very personal question. I feel like it sidesteps the...
No, it doesn't. I'm trying to demonstrate that the vast majority of Christians presuppose that Jesus has already risen from the dead before they go looking for evidence, and they are therefore working contrary to how we go about investigating claims in the real world. Effectively, you're presuming the guilt of Jesus' resurrection over the innocents.
That doesn't have anything to do with the evidence I present, though. So that is a very personal claim. So I mean, that is also a hypothetical. So let's say even if it is true, right? I don't know if I actually would or wouldn't. So that's again really personal and based on a lot of circumstances.
Okay. Well, then why don't we skip that question then? My next question is, why don't you accept the miracles of other religions with the similar attestations? For example, there are thousands of people who attested the divinity and powers of the late Indian guru Satya Sai Baba, who even claims to have been born of a virgin. There's also Apollonius of Tyana, who was a contemporary of Jesus Christ and had several different writings about him, and thousands of people claim to have seen him, well, attested thousands of people claim to have seen him vanish from thin air in the middle of a trial in Greece.
Okay, so do they have... So, I know this is responding in a question, but I would need to have further clarification before I can answer if I would or would not believe, or why I would not believe. Basically, do they have disciples that were willing to be persecuted and have their
How do you know that Jesus had disciples that were willing to be persecuted? That's just church tradition. There's no evidence that ever happened.
Okay, so we have, first of all, we do have actually attestations that Peter himself was
Where?
killed. Okay, so first, let me establish first that it is a historical fact that Christians in the early times were definitely persecuted.
That's not a historical fact. That's a historical consensus.
Excuse me?
That's a historical consensus. Pliny the Elder and Josephus were both contemporaries to the burning of Rome and the reign of Nero. Neither of them mention anything about Christians being persecuted during that time. The earliest accounts of persecution by Christians comes from Tacitus in the year 115 Common Era, but that particular excerpt from his Annals isn't made aware to us until 400 years later. Seneca the Younger mentions something about Christians being persecuted in his plays in the late 3rd century.
Let me interject and further explain exactly what Pliny the Younger says. He regards trials with Christians. Not only is he, just generally out of the blues talking about Christians, but he's regarding actual trials that he himself has conducted. And he talks about how they asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault of error had been that they were accusing to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively to a hymn to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by oath, not to some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, not falsify their trust, nor refuse to return the trust when called upon to do so. This is what the Christians were telling Pliny the Younger, what they were supposed to be doing.
Okay, that's not persecution, though. What you just described isn't persecution, it's a trial.
What do you mean? So yeah, a trial for being Christian,
No,
isn't it?
for ostensibly breaking the law. There was no laws against being a Christian back then. I mean, you're
Okay,
welcome to
so
cite
yeah,
the laws because this was in the Roman-ruled arena of Judea, and they allowed the Jews to be Jews. I don't see why they wouldn't allow the Christians to be Christians.
considering that Nero had a Roman persecution of Christians,
You don't know that
um,
actually happened. As I just stated, neither Pliny the Elder or Josephus ever mention it, and the first mention of it comes about 50 years after it happened.
from Tacitus, who is a respected Roman historian.
Okay, but he
Why
was
would
like
you
5 years
doubt
old
50
when this
years?
was going on, so he didn't witness it. He is repeating what he's heard from hearsay. That's the problem with this. This is all hearsay. We are trying to determine whether or not there's historical evidence for the most amazing event in all of history, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, a one of a kind event. And what
Okay,
we
so
have is hearsay.
let me ask you, what, like I said from the beginning, what would satisfy you? Because it seems that there's a lot of, so you denounce almost everything as hearsay.
Yeah, and
Now,
I will
what
come
would,
out and admit that I don't think that I don't think you could ever argue that the resurrection is a historical fact or that it's historically supported, because you can't repeat the experiment with history. History is based on what most probably happened, and any historian will tell you that from Barterman to Richard Kreisner. They cannot assert with certainty what actually happened in history because you can't repeat the experiment. That's why it's so easy for people to deny historical events that we seem to believe are overwhelming, like the Holocaust, for example. You can't repeat the Holocaust, and so people can say, well, that didn't happen. So when you're trying to determine what most probably happened in history, miracles go out the window as they are defined as an extraordinarily improbable event. Right?
okay, so hold the phone. So one, again, I've referred to this improbability. So I just think that the main issue right now is your epistemology, effectively. So you disregard historical fact simply because of what you consider to be probabilities that you just, I don't
I
know if,
didn't disregard any historical facts. That's a problem right there, saying historical fact. There is no such thing as a historical fact that far back because we can't know for certainty what happened. There are historical consensuses that are disputed. There's almost nothing about history that isn't disputed. Did Julius Caesar cross the Rubicon? We don't know. Most historians agree he did, but there is always a market of people that don't, and they have their reasons for that. We are talking about the most extraordinary event in all of history. And I don't think there's
okay,
enough evidence to satisfy that because extraordinary events or extraordinary claims rather require extraordinary evidence.
okay, let me ask you again then. What would satisfy you?
I just told you nothing, not on a historical basis anyways. If I were to become, convinced of the truth of Christianity through revelation, which seems to be pretty much the only way that happens these days, is I would presuppose the conclusion and thus anything would reaffirm my belief that it happened. But in the same way I don't accept that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, there's nothing that would probably convince me that Dionysus did either, or that Apollonius of Tyana actually vanished in a giant courthouse full of thousands of people. Those things wouldn't convince me. Modern technology reveals to us how some of the magic tricks that we might read about in ancient history are performed. Like, for example, transmaterializing things. Satya Sai Baba is on the internet actually conducting materializing things out of thin air and telekinesis and healing the sick. And we know that that is probably a farce, and nobody really believes it. It doesn't even warrant an hour on the Discovery Channel. But you take that same level of evidence and you put it in pre-scientific antiquated Rome, and it somehow becomes so particularly compelling at that point that half of the entire world decides that it's a legitimate project to organize their lives around that.
Okay, all right, so hold on. So first of all, you're denouncing what we would call historical fact, right? I want you to define
No.
fact for me.
Layman's use the word historical fact. No historian would ever say historical fact.
Uh, can we say like fact? Can we say point of truth that we can
You
conclude,
could say consensus, that would be a better word.
or we can take evidence ourselves? Because what if we look at the writings themselves and we take on what we conclude from those evidences, and we say this is either true or false.
Well, the
Can
problem
we
is,
say that?
people can conclude different things from ancient writings. You conclude that they're all true and that they accurately depict an event that happened 2,000 years ago, which runs contrary to most modern scholarship. But let me ask you this. Muslims believe that Muhammad flew up to heaven on a horse, and the evidence they present is almost identical to that of the resurrection. That would be accounts of the event written decades after it supposedly happened by authors who didn't sign their attestation and who did not write in the first person literary perspective. Would you think this is sufficient evidence for someone flying up to heaven on a horse? And yes, these people likely did die for what they believed because these sorts of events were written during the wars with the Christians.
Okay, well, all right. So would they have material gain
I
from
would
that?
assume so. I mean, Muslims blow themselves up all the time thinking that they're going to go to heaven as a
So they
reward for
have sufficient
martyrdom.
reason to lie.
Um, we don't know if it's a lie. Why are you presenting that false dichotomy? It
I'm
could
no,
be a lie. It
I'm
could be
asking, do they have
misapprehension.
sufficient reason? I'm asking, do they have sufficient reason to lie?
I don't know. Maybe it depends on
If they
what you
have
would define
material
as
gain,
sufficient reason. I would say
okay,
they have
so
just as much of a reason to lie as the gospel authors did.
okay, so now, okay, so hold up. Can we say that material gain, right, from let's say the wars and conquests of Islam, right, are a sufficient enough reason to lie about the basis of
Why would
your
they need to
wars and
lie about it
conquests?
if they're superior in might? It wouldn't matter. You just force them to believe. But these
You're getting into
attestations aren't
anthropology
written
now.
like there is no Muhammad flying up to heaven on a horse is just a fantastical event. It's a myth. But this event was written about almost 150 years after it would have happened
Okay,
by
well,
people
hold
that
on.
we don't know who wrote the event. But it's in Islamic lore as something that actually happened.
Okay, but we can have conceived possibilities that people that
Right.
propagated this event, right,
There's a lot. There's
were,
way more
let's say,
things that are far more
warlords
probable.
that don't need to be on the front lines and can convince masses of people to either convert or die, right, to
1 minute.
this claim that they've made and move forward. I think that our issue right now is epistemology because um, I'm just gonna end it there. Like I'll leave you with the last word, I suppose.
Okay, so I just want to ask you just this last question.
Sure.
So you asked me what would convince me that Jesus actually did die and rise again. What would convince you that he didn't?
What would convince me that he didn't?
Yeah.
30
Um,
seconds.
yeah, the faulty faulty evidence, I suppose.
Okay.
Um, a body in the tomb, some recantation under the apostles. Um,
Well, Eusebius does document many churches and apostles that did recant, and and
10
I said in that
seconds.
quote that he deliberately omit the mystery. But let's go ahead and end it there and go into the questioning or the closings. You can close and then I'll close.
sure. Um, so essentially, I'm going to start with epistemology because number one of um, my argument that claims um, that have sufficient evidence can be reasonably believed to be true. The whole mantra of extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence is based on the faulty assumption that miracles and such are somehow considered to be unlikely and therefore should be discarded as even a possibility within history. Considering that we're on the basis of we're discussing a supernatural event, and you're doing that because of what we have uh, natural explanations for the way the world works, which is based on science, hence the epistemology of finding natural explanations for the world, not studying supernatural, but studying the natural functions of the world. Um, we have to remember that what we're discussing is a singular event. Did the apostles witness the resurrection of Christ? Now, did they believe that they witnessed? You can go back, at least say, did they believe that? You can go back further. Did they write about it? Were they persecuted? You can conclude simple, yes, facts, points of truth from pieces of evidence and clues that are construed together and make one
conclusion. And I would posit the conclusion with all the evidence that we do have somehow being put together. If, let's say, my opponent is correct about all the other possibilities, somehow all these gospels are forgeries, even though they have a unanimous point of contention. If, let's say, Christians weren't persecuted somehow, despite our external evidence having that, being with Christians seen as outcast by both Roman and Jews, if this all true somehow, in some way, there's a giant conspiracy working to somehow construct Christianity within less than a century and prop it all together, then that I would say is almost equally as miraculous, because something like that has never ever happened before. And that has had no previous accounting, just as no previous event throughout history would have had that kind of evidence, that kind of surmounting work to construct this kind of evidence from oral tradition, especially with the culture that has such kind of oral tradition, construed to conclude a certain event. No other time in history has something like that ever happened before. So if my opponent wants to state that the miraculous cannot happen because it never happened before, then I'm afraid that this debate simply would have to stop right at epistemology.
My turn?
Ray, when you are.
I'm not going to take my full 5 for closing, as it's going to be pretty concise. The only accounts of the resurrection of Jesus Christ are 4 contradictory third-person stories produced decades after the events they describe, and written by anonymous authors with no other works attributed to them. This is the consensus of the majority of scholars. So much so that it could be almost argued as a historical fact, at least in the same sense that my opponent argues historical facts from his perspective. Such evidence wouldn't suffice for a banality, let alone an extraordinary event like rising from the dead. My opponent argues from the presupposition that Jesus Christ was in fact the Son of God, and his position is not predicated on the historical support of the resurrection, but rather his trust in the church and its claims and his faith in his own religion. If this standard of evidence were enough to accept outright violations of the laws of nature, why then is it unreasonable to believe that Elvis Presley or Adolf Hitler are still alive and well? Should we also believe in the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, the Rougarou, or the Jersey Devil? What about the millions of people with consistent accounts of being abducted by aliens and medically experimented on? Or how about the claims of other religious figures with similar powers? Satya Sai Baba was an Indian spiritual leader who many religious figures believed to have been the reincarnation of a past Hindu spiritual master. Tens of thousands of people attest to the divinity of this man, who died back in 2011 and had 5 million people show up to his funeral. He is recorded on YouTube demonstrating his magic powers by materializing objects seemingly out of thin air, casting out demons, and healing sick people. Yet no Christian would ever even entertain the possibility of that being remotely legitimate. All of a sudden, the unabridged credulity that Christians exhibit regarding these sorts of things about their religion, their own religion, vanish into the ether, and they're all hardened skeptics. Every explanation becomes infinitely more probable than Satya Sai Baba is truly divine and has magic powers. It's almost as if the fallacies and miracles, it's almost as if the fallacies of miracles and magic become all too apparent in other people's beliefs, but not your own. Even worse, on an objective basis, the quantity and quality of the evidence in favor of Satya Sai Baba actually performing miracles far exceeds any evidence presented for Jesus Christ doing the same. If video evidence of a man using telekinesis doesn't convince you, but 2,000-year-old anonymous manuscripts do, you are not operating under any consideration for actual evidence, and you should stop pretending that you do. On October 13th, 1917, 50,000 people claimed to have watched the sun dance in the sky at 2 p.m. in Fatima, Portugal. Yet we know that didn't happen, despite their attestations that it did. Were they all lying? Or did they see some hallucination? We don't know. But at 2 p.m. in Fatima, Portugal, 127 other countries and 1.5 billion people were also watching the sun, and nobody saw it dance. Now, my opponent might erect a false dichotomy. They're either lying, or it's true. I would say that maybe there's an infinite amount of other possible explanations that we just don't know yet. And as far as the resurrection of Jesus Christ goes, we don't know. Next.
All right. So if you want to ask a question, just type 1 in chat for me. All right, as soon as we get Anchor in here, I'll start the time. All right, Anchor, you're on.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, we
Good?
got you, buddy.
All right, thanks. So I feel like this should have been said right at the very beginning, but so you said your position is that miracles can't happen because it's against the laws of physics and nature, right?
No, that's not my position.
What is your position?
My position is that
Regarding that.
miracles are infinitesimally improbable and therefore they cannot be reasonably established on a historical basis because history is determined by what most probably happened.
Well, what makes miracles improbable?
If they weren't improbable, we wouldn't call them miracles. If something like rising from the dead happened all the time, it wouldn't be considered a miracle.
Well, that's the point of a miracle, that it doesn't happen all the time.
So you agree that it's improbable?
I agree it's improbable.
Okay, there we go.
However, I'm not done. I feel like you're trying to dance around the fact that you're saying it's impossible.
I'm not saying it's impossible, no.
Well, just because it's improbable, why is this an issue that may have happened?
No, okay, so the debate is over whether or not there's historical evidence for the resurrection of
Yeah.
Jesus. And my point is that you cannot have historical evidence for a miracle because those are so improbable that they run contrary to how we determine what history is. So I'm not arguing Jesus didn't rise from the dead. It may very well be the case that he did. There's plenty of things that happened throughout history that I don't have any evidence for. I'm sure that there's a murder that probably happened in the year 1510 that nobody knows about because we don't have any evidence for it. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. But as far as miracles go, it is a Herculean task to demonstrate that any of them happened even in today's world, let alone 2,000 years ago.
Okay, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay. Guys, in the future, when you jump up on here, just tell us who you're addressing the question to. If you don't address the question to both of us, we will not both answer. So make sure that if you want us both to answer, that you tell us both.
All right, please actually type 1 like Anchor did so that I know if you're being serious or not.
I think it goes Ismail, then Biff, then Ronk Rolls, then Christian. All
right,
I
Ismail,
think
you're up.
Connecticut Girl wants to ask a question too.
You there? Bruh. Guess we're on to Biff.
Can you? I'm assuming everybody can hear me, right?
Yes.
At least all the relevant parties. Okay, great. I have a question regarding your trust of historical documents. It seems that you think that historical documents, at least ancient documents.
Wait, who are you talking to?
Oh, sorry. This is OhManMyBad.
Okay.
You seem to think that they're as equally attested, or at least as equally reliable, as modern forms of documentation when they're not. You dismiss Tacitus's claim because it's 50 years, at least recorded 50 years after the events they describe. That's incredibly close as far as ancient history is concerned. That is almost as far as comparing it to other ancient manuscripts. That's pretty much as accurate as it gets. Like, it's not going to get closer to the actual material than that. And you do know that the Gospels are far and away the most attested to ancient document. That I mean, literally far like 4 times more attested than the next most reliable document.
What do you mean by attested?
More copies, more cross attestation. So meaning that there are documents on the other side of the world that are also very ancient that match earlier copies that are thousands of miles away.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, now let me finish my point, and then you can have all the time to respond. You also, and then the claim that, for example, that Tacitus would be like very incorrect is ridiculous. He also has a reputation to protect. 50 years, anybody who's 60, 65, 70 would would be able to recall these events, and they would say Tacitus is a liar. Don't buy his histories. How is he going to be reliable record of events if he's fabricating something that somebody alive in his day could call him out on and dismiss? His whole reputation would be tarnished. So you need to. I really think you're throwing out a lot of historical evidence because you have an aversion to miracles. It's this old Humean idea, but that's really all I have to say.
Okay. Yeah, like I said, I have an aversion to miracles. I won't deny that. My position is that miracles are extremely improbable, and so the evidence required to support them would be, immense. It would have to be as equally extraordinary. As far as, copies, that doesn't mean anything. There are 24,000 some odd copies of the Gospels, and some of them are so radically different from one another that you can't even tell they're telling the same story. There are more differences in these Gospels than there are words in the Gospels. The way things were copied down back then were obviously by hand, and if one scribe made an error, the next person who copied would make that same error and then make their own errors, and then so on and so forth. I agree that the Gospels are the most copied, but that's not because they're true necessarily. It's because they were dogma, and the Catholic Church started an empire with Rome. So, of course, when that's pretty much the only book anybody has available to them, that's what they're going to copy. What verified gospel is so egregiously different that it tells a different question? Okay. Well, take the Gospel of Nicodemus, for example. Or the Gospel of Judas, which just recently released. We have plenty of examples. Again, I can't answer 10 million questions at once. If you want to ask me a question, you have to come into the chat, so I can't focus on that. Let me finish answering this one question. But as far as historical reliability goes, with Tacitus, I don't think he was lying. There's plenty of explanations. Perhaps he was telling the truth. My point is that his information is coming from hearsay. He's writing down what he's being told by people around him, and so perhaps the story has been a little bit fabricated. But my point was that he doesn't have a lot of contemporary reinforcement of that, because Josephus and Pliny the Elder do not describe Nero accusing Christians for being being responsible for the fires in Rome. That was my point. I don't have a problem accepting Tacitus's attestations of the Christians and Christus as authentic, at least in the sense that he believed what he was writing. So, next question.
All right, I Find Christian, you're up next.
Hello? Hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Alright, OhManMyBad. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you said earlier that it's more likely that the disciples lied for their beliefs rather than were martyred because someone couldn't come back from the dead. Is that right?
I said that it's more probable for somebody to lie and die for it than it is for somebody to rise from the dead, because we have plenty of examples of people lying and dying for it than we have for resurrection. If Jesus' resurrection actually happened, it would be the only one in all of history, except with maybe the addition of Lazarus, since Jesus rose Lazarus from the dead as well.
Alright, but answer me this: if Jesus truly was God, do you think there'd be any difficulty at all with him resurrecting himself?
I don't, but you would have to presuppose that.
No, if he was God, do you think he could?
I think he could do whatever. I don't think he would have died if he was God, but yeah, sure.
Well, he was God and human.
Well, how do you know that?
Because it says so in the Bible.
Okay, this guy's a troll. Get him off the mic.
Okay.
That was a blatant troll. No. For the Bible tells me so. Okay, that's. I don't even know how to begin to respond to that. Pious, did you take that seriously?
The last claim, not really.
Like, it says so in the Bible, therefore it's true. Is that serious?
I feel like it could be a lot more nuanced, but it doesn't sound
Okay,
serious.
I shouldn't have had him get kicked off. Okay, so let me answer that. That was mature of me. All right, so because the Bible tells me so is not a valid form of argument, right? The Bible is the claim. We need evidence for the claim. Lots of historical books claim that there's a God, that a God man that walked around. Joseph Smith, right, for example, claimed that he was the final prophet of Jesus Christ, and that his brother and his father even also claimed alongside him to have seen the golden tablets he was copying from. And Joseph Smith was murdered for what he claimed to be true. Now, if anybody was in a position to know that Mormonism was false, it would be Joseph Smith. And yet he died for this lie anyway. So we have plenty of examples of the Bible or other religious texts making claims, but we don't immediately accept them. It's not because it's a religious text, though. The gospel makes a lot of extraordinary claims that we know aren't true. For example, the census in Luke. No historian believes that ever happened. The slaughter of innocents under Herod that Matthew talks about, no historian agrees that actually happened. The Bible also makes some scientific claims that are not exactly accurate. For example, it taxonomically classifies bats as birds. It describes the Earth as a flat disk with a dome on top. These things we understand to be interpolations because of what people understood about the world. So I don't think that the Bible says so is a really good argument. Just because it says the Bible says so doesn't mean it's false, but it doesn't mean it's true, if that makes sense. Next on, Mike.
All right, Mac, you're up. If he's still here. Okay. I don't see anyone else putting one in the chat.
Does anybody else want to ask a question? Type a one in the chat. We got a bunch of people typing. Yeah, if you want to ask again, if there's nobody in line, you can keep coming up and asking questions all you want.
All right, Biff, come back there.
Thank you. I do have a question as to then. So for you, what would count as a proper attestation? Because the way that you would throw aside the Gospels as though they aren't a reliable, like look at it this way: you can't say that you saw the risen Jesus and then not be a religious source or not be a biased source. The moment you make a claim that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, you have become a biased source. You have become a Christian source. So is it really a surprise then that every single person that seems to claim that Jesus died and rose from the dead is an apostle and is
That's not true.
somebody who would well, as far as what we have in front of us, these are all claims handed down from the apostles. At least this is what Christians would acknowledge.
There's plenty of non-canonical
given-
sources of people who claim to have seen Jesus rise from the dead, and they didn't accept that he was the risen Christ.
But
Again, the Gospel of Nicodemus.
Those are relevant to our question though, because for example, nobody here accepts Barnabas, right? We're not talking about these sort of one-off manuscripts where somebody was sitting down, scribbling one day that their claim or imitating the real Gospels that or at least the authentic Gospels as Christians would believe them to be. We're talking about people who would say that they saw Jesus again alive, and many of these people, for example, we don't have. In the Bible, of course, Paul dies before he could finish everything he wanted to do, right? So we don't have, for example, Paul saying, "Today I'm being executed," etc., etc. But he was in chains, and that was the last thing we see from him. So I think it's safe to assume he died there, right? That's a person that it's safe to assume he died. Otherwise, he would have written to the church and said, "Hey, look, I'm alive," right? But it stopped there. So
okay, but Paul wasn't an eyewitness to the resurrection. He received it through revelation, according to him in Galatians.
Which is even more incredible. And in fact, Paul goes through great pain.
Particularly,
Paul goes to great pains to verify what he's saying. He says, "I actually met with some of the disciples, and I hadn't talked to them before this point. Yet we were preaching the same thing, right?"
Okay.
So he even anticipates people who would doubt his claims in the future.
So what's your question then?
The question is, if all these concurrent events, concurrent stories where Paul calls people to go talk to people who saw saw Jesus Christ risen from the dead as well as him, how does none of this count for you? How are you able to just shrug it off as though it's just some other ancient source that we dug up, a one-off source where somebody was claiming that like a donkey levitated? I think there's a little more to it than that.
With the whole witnesses thing that we see in 1 Corinthians, first of all, Paul doesn't name any of those witnesses. He just says that they exist. The letter to 1 Corinthians, particularly chapter 15, is in response to a couple of the church leaders asking Paul, why should we believe that the resurrection actually happened? And he begins chapter 15 with that creed. But again, none of them are named, and Paul writes this particular letter 25 years after the event happened, and he's writing to Corinth, Greece, a city 2,000 miles away from Palestine, where these witnesses would live. So it's not exactly like any of the people that he's writing to would be able to confirm these witnesses actually existed. But attesting to something, I don't really understand why you seem to think that because a lot of people said this happened, that means it happened. I just gave the example in my closing of the miracle of the sun in Fatima, Portugal, where 50,000 people who were looking at the sun without going blind somehow saw the sun move around. Like it danced in the sky, or it flashed radiant colors. 50,000. But on that same day, at that same time, 1.5 billion other people also saw the sun. They didn't report seeing this amazing thing. So there are plenty of examples of a lot of people with similar stories saying, yeah, I witnessed this event. And then we have no real evidence that it actually happened. I agree that most people, if they saw the risen Jesus, would probably convert to Christianity. But we have at least one example of that not happening, the Gospel of Nicodemus. My point isn't that Jesus wasn't real, that he didn't die, that he didn't have followers. It's that we don't have enough historical evidence to determine that he actually rose from the dead. Again, because history is determined by probability, not by fact, because we can't repeat the experiment. So that's my answer.
All right, Mac, you're in. Oh, come on, man. I gave you a second chance.
Hello, can you hear me?
There we go.
All right. My question is for Pious. So what? You mentioned that there's historical evidence for Jesus being buried, and you believe that one of the reasons that you don't think that one of the reasons that you think the resurrection happened is because no one can produce a body. But what about like the possibility that maybe Jesus was never buried? Because I think the only places where we get that where he was buried in a tomb and provided by Joseph of Arimathea is from the Gospels, but I don't believe we get that from anywhere else, any other historical documents.
Okay. So obviously you can propose any other possibility you want, right? But I'm gonna adopt to what my opponent has said, that history determined by probability. Sure, we can go ahead and attest to that, but I hope that this probability, what we mean by probability is that we're concluding a certain point from the evidence that we have to be the most likely point to be true. Now, if my opponent has presupposed that miracles are the least improbable thing to happen, then of course he's going to go ahead and propose any other possibility over the miraculous thing to happen. So what do we have? We have my opponent saying that miracles are the most improbable thing to happen because they're not happening all the time. That is not a good basis for probability. Just because I'm not dropping my pen all the time doesn't mean it's improbable I will drop my pen. That's not how things work. Probability is determined by what has happened before, so what will happen in the future, right? So if we go and discuss about miracles and say that miracles are improbable, therefore if miracles don't happen often, therefore they're improbable. It's just very weak. That's pseudo mathematics. It's pseudo mathematics. So miracles are effectively defined to be supernatural events, not events that rarely happen. If it is true that events that rarely happen are to be defined as miracles, then we can effectively consider the Big Bang to be a miraculous event. We can effectively consider the American Revolution to be a miraculous event because no other revolution has happened specifically inside the United States has happened. Well, we're not talking specifically about what naturally happens and then what happens outside that scope. For all we know, the very fact that someone coming back from the dead could have been an anomaly within the bounds of the natural. So all things considered, considering that the whole basis of denying the other possibilities of of the small claims, because what I'm doing is I'm having a small claim that these gospels were written by the authors, and if you dismiss that specifically on the basis that that evidence is eventually going to lead into the resurrection, so therefore I'm going to deny this point of contention, then you know what? Perhaps then we're going to go ahead and do it on the basis of we're going to have big disagreements about epistemology. So if you're going to go and tell me it is possible that he was never buried within a tomb, then yeah, sure, you could be absolutely right that it is possible. However, it is very unlikely because of the fact that we have 4 different accounts. The fact that the man was buried. Not even 4 accounts. We have 5 accounts. We have one from Corinthians, from Paul. We have these 5 accounts are extremely important, considering that they're all the evidence that we have about what happened to the man. They're all the information that we do have. And to dismiss that just because of the fact that it'll eventually lead to a conclusion you do not want to make because it is unlikely, then perhaps we can conclude anything really from history.
All right, next person. I Funding Christian, you're up next.
All right, OhManMyBad. You don't believe in God, right? You maintain the position that God does not exist, correct?
No,
What's your position?
I'm not convinced that God exists.
So you just maintain the belief that he does not exist?
No, I'm not convinced he does exist.
Okay, where do you get your morality from?
I
Do you
don't
think we
really
live in
understand
an objective universe or an amoral universe?
I don't understand what that has to do with the debate.
Does it have to pertain to the debate? Can I not ask like similar questions?
I guess, I'll answer it. I develop my moral basis through an understanding of how my actions affect other people and the best way a society tends to grow, and a recognition of how reality seems to be. That's where I get my morals from.
All right, Anchor, you're up next.
Hello? Okay. One of you, Mr. My bad. One of your arguments was that you took issue with how the Gospels are written. Could you reinstate that? I kind of forgot a little bit.
The Gospels are written in the third-person literary perspective, which is not something that eyewitnesses write in. If you write a story about something you personally saw, you would write I, right? You would use the personal pronoun I, and you would write I saw this happen, or I was there when this happened, or this happened to me. We know that the Gospels write about things they could not possibly have witnessed. For example, the Gospel of Matthew writes about the birth of Jesus Christ. And he writes about the birth of Jesus Christ in the exact same literary perspective as he writes about the calling of Matthew in chapter 9. Which, if he was the true author of that Gospel, he probably would have changed literary perspectives on that particular note. Luke writes about the birth of Jesus Christ in the same literary context that he writes everything else. He also writes about the trial under Pilate, which Luke wouldn't have seen. Luke himself is not even attested to have been an eyewitness of the events described in the Gospels, nor John Mark. And John Mark is the first Gospel written according to the overwhelming majority of scholarship, because Matthew copies directly from Mark. Almost 90% of Mark is in Matthew. And why would an eyewitness need to copy from Mark? And because we know, we're reasonably certain these are not eyewitnesses. That's my issue.
What I would say is that, how would you know that I think you're assuming that this eyewitness is directly writing these and not them giving their account to the people and other to write. And another thing I think you don't take into consideration, I think you should, is that you're assuming that a document written 2,000 years ago from a completely different culture is going to be written in a way you would expect it to be written in like modern day Western culture. And I think
All
it's
right,
something you
Anchor,
take into consideration.
I'm sorry to cut you off, man, but I want to know your specific question. We kind of need to wrap.
I just wanted to know what his position and why he thought he took issue with the way it was written.
Many documents back. Paul writes in the first person. Why couldn't the Gospels?
Well, are you saying is that the way you want it to be written, or the way you think it should? Because
if it's an eyewitness testimony, it would be written in the first person.
Well, we're assuming that it's eyewitness themselves writing it, and not someone taking their account and writing it in the third person that way.
No, that's my point, is that the Gospels were not eyewitness accounts. That's why they're written in the third person literary perspective.
Yeah, so that's all I have to say.
Think we have enough time for one more question?
Right. And after this question, if people want to keep coming in and asking, I'll actually open up the chat and everybody can talk. But I'm gonna end the recording at this question.
All right. It looks like. Never mind.
Do we have anybody else that wants to ask a question to connect to the chat room? Looks like that's a no, so I'm going to stop the recording there and initiate the upload.